Erev Tov, everyone. We're continuing from our discussion last week on Jewish business ethics, which again, these are real life things that typically are around money and business type relationship and contractual things that come up in our everyday lives. Some of them are quite ancient and what you would have found thousands of years ago, and some of them are more modern, but the principles behind them are based on texts going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And one of the things we discussed last week is that sometimes when the rabbis are posed with a new situation about some sort of relationship, about paying someone on time, they look at the Torah, and the Torah explicitly says, pay your workers on time. And then they can base off that verse and the context, the language of it, they can derive new principles. What if you can't pay them on time because they haven't finished the job, or you have to send in the check, all these other variations. But oftentimes there are cases which are not explicitly discussed within the Torah. And then it's either a matter of finding an oral tradition or a principle. Again, the oral tradition is not just a list of laws, like a 10,000 page book list of laws. A lot of it are principles and values that have been passed down for thousands of years, at least 1,500, certainly longer, as opposed to the written Torah, which is even older than that. And they base the rulings for today off of those values and early rulings. And the tension is always what seems to be the most, the act of integrity, like what's the right thing to do versus what's technically permitted. And some of the things we found last class is maybe technically it's permitted to do such and such thing, but because everybody looks at a Jew and thinks however that Jew acts, they're going to judge that Jew, all Jews, and ultimately God, then a Jew needs to go above and beyond. And the first case we're going to talk about tonight really gets into one of those issues of integrity. So what I'll do is I'll share a hypothetical case and we'll hear people's thoughts on it, and then we'll jump into the sources and see if we can get a kind of answer or a strong suggestion. There are times when even in the areas of Jewish business ethics, there's no final answer. This is the best thing to do, but it really depends on the situation. So in this first case, very simple question. Somebody works a 9-to-5 job. Are they allowed to moonlight? Can they, after their work, go home, have a little dinner, and then do a job at night? We're on the telephone lines, and then the next day they come into work and they're getting their work done. They're a little bit exhausted. Maybe they're not doing their best work, not giving 100%, but they are getting the job done. That's the key here. I'm not talking about somebody who moonlights, and because of that moonlighting, they're coming in and they're not getting their job done and they're making mistakes all the time. Not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is somebody who it's affecting their job a little bit, but not in a significant way. And is that appropriate? Are they allowed to do that if it has even the smallest effect on their main job? And I'll leave it there. There's some other value statements that we'll make as we go along, but just on that first thing, is someone allowed to moonlight, take on the additional job if it will have some minimal effect on the success of their first job? Again, they're getting the work done, but they're not doing as good a job as they could. Should that be permitted? Thoughts? And you just raise your hand and then I'll unmute you. Yeah, Jane, just got to unmute yourself and then go for it. Please.
I actually have an example of that, and I don't know if I'd like to see how the rabbis deal with it before I tell you the example that came in Ellis's professional career, where he had an employee, a fellow doctor, and he was the supervisor, and that was the situation.
Where this person was taking on extra work and it was affecting their job?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very, very important. And by the way, this is the case I'm presenting there. Just curious, we'll see if we can answer. But the sources we'll see here can apply to like so many different variations about how somebody applies themselves to their job, and how much they value the time. Let's say it's a 9-to-5 job. How do they work during that time? Because in our society today, there's kind of two extremes. And one, sadly, I know from a lot of my friends, people who burn themselves out. If your job is 9-to-5, these people work 9 to 8, and they don't take lunch. They lunch at their desk if they do. Or people at Amazon is a great example where they don't even go to the bathroom. Or people who are delivery drivers who put on their seatbelt behind their back, so it looks like they're seatbelted in, but it takes too many extra seconds for them to properly put on and take off their seatbelt. So that's one extreme. And the other extreme is one that I've really only seen in films, the person who never worked a day in their life, but they make it look to their boss like they're doing work. They cannot fake it, and they just do the absolute bare minimum. So the question is, does Jewish law have thoughts on how much somebody has to, how hard basically someone has to work? Does it have a law against slacking off, as it were, even if we're not talking about the extreme? So I think any other thoughts on whether you think moonlighting would be permitted if it has a minor effect? Yeah, Anna, just got to unmute on your side. And yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah. I think one factor that I would hypothesis of the important fact is whether or not this 9 to 5 is paying them enough to make their jobs.
Oh, interesting. So first, I just want to say there's something, the voice thing is a little bit off, so I'm sorry about that, but I think I got the gist of what you're saying about, is the job a job that's treating them, you didn't say treating them with respect, but think about the factors. If the job is paying them a living wage, if it's a job where they're being abused, they're being disrespectful, or there's just no one could reasonably expect that someone working this job could work that job alone. And the unfortunate truth, and again, this is a factual truth, is that many jobs out there that are 9 to 5 paying jobs, they absolutely do not pay at all enough for people to be able to afford a home, to afford food, to put their kids through school, whatever it is like that. And the only way that they can even make enough to get by is to get multiple jobs that will exhaust them and affect their ability to do their jobs really well. Now, obviously, if someone has enough jobs that they're failing at all their jobs, that's one extreme. But we're talking about people who are just so exhausted that, fine, they're not the model employee, they're not employee of the month, but you know what? They're getting by and they have to. They have to do the minimum. They have to not be their best, or they can't afford to take care of their family. So that's a very important factor that we will consider here. Excellent, so thank you for that. So Jane, I'll leave you unmuted. So the first place this conversation here, there's not something explicit in the Torah. It's actually a value conversation. And a lot of rabbis will point to the discussion about this particular scholar, Abba Chilkiah, and his philosophy towards work. And the conversation kind of starts there. Look how seriously he takes work, and everything grows out of there. So go ahead, Jane, please.
Okay. When there was a rain shortage, the rabbis would send messengers to Abba Chilkiah, who would in turn pray for rain, whereupon rain would fall. Once a pair of scholars was sent to him for this purpose. They found him working in the fields. They greeted him, but he did not respond in kind. Later, they asked him, "Why did you not respond appropriately when we greeted you?" He replied, "I am a hired employee and I did not wish to squander my employer's time."
Excellent, thank you. So now this does not speak directly to the idea of moonlighting, but it does talk about when somebody's working, there's no slacking off. They should, because basically, and then it'll say it in some of the later sources, my time is my employer's time. If I am, and again, I'll say it explicitly later, if I'm slacking off in a way that is inappropriate, and we'll talk about what's appropriate and inappropriate, like, am I allowed to go to the bathroom? But if I'm slacking off in any way, I'm basically stealing from my employer. They're paying me for the work I do. If I'm not doing the work, then they shouldn't pay me for it. So Abba Chilkiah is like, he's the employee of the, of the century, of the millennium, et cetera, like that. But that's the principal value that the rabbis point to, is that when you're working and you are being paid for the time that you are working, every second counts, because you are getting paid for every single moment. And again, the employer probably expects that you're going to the bathroom, which is why what happens at like Amazon warehouses is so just really awful. That these employees actually do lose their jobs directly or indirectly from, if they have a medical condition, taking bathroom breaks a little too often, and they can't do as many orders, they'll be let go for that. But Abba Chilkiah, it's not about you can never take a break. It's, this is not my time right now. Not that I'm a slave, but I'm getting paid for this time, and it's not my time to slack off and talk to friends. Just kind of one extreme, but it sets the values. The next thing here is we're already actually moving into some practical rulings coming out of this. If it is not my time, how far does that go? What if there is a mitzvah or there's an obligation to pray? Does that take precedence over my working for my employer? So Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this is actually where the conversation, legally speaking, that's where the biggest conversation happens, which is if it's the middle of the day and it's time for me to pray, but I'm on the clock for my employer, can I say, sorry, God, I'm being paid right now, and that value is even higher than praying at the right time. So first we start in the Talmud, and then we'll see in the 16th century how it's ruled. So go ahead, Elizabeth, please, source number 2.
Workers who are working for an employee should recite the Shema and pray. When they eat bread, they should not recite the blessing before eating and should only recite the after blessing in an abridged form.
Excellent. So it's kind of a compromise view here, which there are certain obligations like the Shema, which is a mitzvah from the Torah, and there's also a set time to do it. They can't just do it when they go home. They have to say it before, the 4th hour of the day. Like there's a set time. Morning prayers have to happen some point during the morning. So fine, they can do that. And the Talmud actually does talk about doing it, saying these prayers up in a tree. So if they're workers working up in a tree, they should not climb down, go to a building for prayer. Again, today, practically a break time, et cetera. But no, they would literally pray on the job. So that idea of, a working lunch, eating lunch at one's desk while one's working, that's kind of reflected here is obviously you have to pray to God, but the Talmud elsewhere says, do it in an abridged format. If you have to eat, of course you say a blessing, but don't say the full long blessing because it's not your time. Yes, you are not allowed to eat without a blessing, and we're not going to say that you can break Jewish law, but in terms of obligations and doing all the extra stuff, don't do the extra stuff, because this is not your time and you need to take as little as possible away from your job. You need to give basically, let's say 98% of yourself to your job. That 2% is fine, bathroom breaks or prayer. 98% of you needs to be fully focused on the job. So now we are kind of getting towards the principle about doing anything that would take away from your job. And Elizabeth, I'll have you take source 3 because it's so short. This is the 16th century, how this is practically ruled, please.
In today's world, most people are not as particular about their employees' time. So the assumption is that the worker is hired with the understanding that he may recite the Amidah prayer.
Excellent, thank you. Now, this is building off of the Talmud, but it adds a really interesting thing, which is, when this was written, at least in the 16th century, that a lot of these workers or these supervisors and bosses are not going to care if someone takes 5-10 minutes in the middle of the day to do the prayer. Now, this is obviously speaking in perhaps the context of, if you live in Israel, where it's more common for people to stop and pray, but you could apply this principle to a lot of different situations. Most bosses are generally okay if a worker goes up to get a cup of water or uses the restroom. Again, unfortunately, we're seeing, particularly in America, it's actually almost, I don't say entirely unique in America, but particularly in America, maybe a few other countries, where bathroom breaks are not so okay anymore if it affects one's productivity, and bosses are getting insane and they're no longer thinking about the workers and what's reasonable for them to do. But for most reasonable bosses, and I met plenty of bosses and workers like this, oh, you need a couple minutes to sit down, to take a quick drink, to use the restroom, that's totally fine. However, one thing that is added on here in a commentary in the Mishnah Brura is you really can't make these assumptions about taking a 15-minute break in the middle of the day. You really need to check with your employer. And if your employer is okay with it, then it's totally fine to do. But again, if there's something, and this is important when ruling on this, can a worker go to take a water cooler break for 2 minutes if it'll help with their productivity? If most bosses would say, oh yeah, that's fine. If taking a 2-minute break every hour will allow them to not get sick, will allow them to refocus, most bosses, hopefully we can assume, would be okay with that. And if most are okay with it, then taking a little break, doing a little bit, would be fine during the day. So whatever is reasonable, and most bosses would say, yeah, I'm okay with that, that would also be permitted. So again, we would think about our original question, would most bosses be okay with a worker giving 60% if they're getting all the work done? Or would most bosses say, look, you're getting the job done, you're getting all the work on time, but I know you're capable of more. So quit the moonlighting job and give me 100% or you're fired. Is that realistic? And the truth is, I'm not sure. I haven't worked in retail or those kind of industries enough to know what most bosses would say. Again, if most bosses would say, I just care if the work gets done, as long as you're responsible and on time, I don't really care. Or would most bosses say, I need 100% or you're fired? Can't imagine that's what they'd say, but those are the factors we're dealing with. Now, The next source here is from a work called Mesilat Yesharim, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, I believe 18th century, 19th century. And it's interesting. It's a work that brings in ethics and a lot of mysticism and Kabbalah, but he also talks about just general Jewish values. And he talks a little bit about the values and the way that a Jew should approach work. So let's see. Gloria and Leonard, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you, and Gloria, I'll zoom in a wee bit. If you could take this little section from Mesilat Yesharim by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal for short, please.
And our forefather Yaakov stated explicitly, quote, I was consumed by heat during the day and frost by night, and I kept sleep away from my eyes, end quote. What will a person say who involved himself in his own leisurely activity while he was supposed to be working for someone else? The bottom line is, when someone is hired for another's work, all of the involved time is actually sold to the employer. Whatever he takes from them for himself is simply theft. Even if he performs a mitzvah during that time, it will not be considered righteousness, but rather a transgression. God is interested only in integrity, as it is written, quote, my eyes are trained upon those of the land with integrity. They shall sit with me.
Excellent. In many ways, this is a very good summary of some of the principles that we've been laying out here, which is, again, it's not my time, therefore I cannot take advantage of it, because me slacking off on the job in a significant way, in an unreasonable way, is no different, according to this, and really Jewish law, than me going into the employer's house, or let's say a store that I'm working at, and just stealing objects. If he's paying me and I'm not actually doing the work, then I'm basically just straight up stealing from him. And I think that's a fairly reasonable, logical assumption to make. So if the case we had started with was, what if an employer or an employee decides they want to take a nap in the middle of the day? They're like, you know what, things aren't really going on, so I could be doing stuff now, but he's not explicitly, the store, no one's in the store. I'm going to take a 10-minute nap because no one's going to notice. The way this is proposed, not just as a legal matter about stealing, but it's also a matter of integrity. And I would say, based on everything we've seen, an employee just taking a nap because no one's going to notice is not okay. Just like stealing a couple staples is not okay. Now, plenty of people say, oh, it's not a big deal. Everyone does it. Well, if everyone does it, and it's something that most employers and bosses say, oh, I don't mind if people take a quick nap, not a big deal, then it becomes okay. And that's a really important balance here. If the common custom is that taking staplers or paper clips is totally okay, which it's not the common custom that it's okay, then it might be all right. And again, if the common custom is that workers can just be, I don't want to say lazy, that's not appropriate, but workers can just do whatever they want with their time and slack off, and bosses are okay with it, maybe that's all right. But again, that's not the common custom. Now, again, the problem is the extreme, at least in the United States, is taken over, where workers expect, or employers, bosses, expect their workers to be working, 27 hours a day, something insane, and never to take care of their personal needs. That's not reasonable. But let's say there's a worker working 9 to 5, and every day their job is physically and mentally demanding, and they really do need to take more than their 20-minute lunch break. They need to take a 10-minute break at the end of the day. And if they take that 10-minute break that's technically not allowed, they will be far more productive. It will help with their physical health. They'll be a better worker. Based on what we've seen so far, it seems like that might be okay if a boss would be all right with that. If a boss wouldn't be, then we get into some gray territory. But now we're going to get to the last source, which talks about things done outside of work and whether or not they affect the work and permitted. And here is an explicit ruling from the Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruch, again, from 1563, is in 4 main sections. The first one is Orach Chaim, which is stuff that comes up pretty much every day, or regular cycles, like including holidays. Second is Yoreh Deah, which is things that are less common, don't always come up, like kashrut and marriage and conversion. They come up, but not all the time. The third one is Even HaEzer, laws of marriage. So that's not in Yoreh Deah, sorry, it's in the third one. And the last one is Choshen Mishpat, which are civil laws and business stuff. So Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in and move this up so you can see the whole text. And Leonard, if you would please take this ruling from the Shulchan Aruch, based on everything we've seen so far, this is how he rules about someone doing something outside of work that might affect their work. So Leonard, please.
Worker is not permitted to work at night and hire himself out during the day. He may not starve or torture himself through food deprivation and feed the food that he has thus saved to his son, because this is theft of the work of his employer, since he will be physically and mentally weakened and will be unable to do the work for the employer with strength. Just as an employer is warned that he must not steal his employees' wages, nor may he delay paying them, so too the worker is warned that he may not steal the work of his employer and relax a little here and a little there. Rather, he is obligated to be exacting of himself to work during the entire time allotted for working with his full strength, as Yaakov stated, Bereshit 31, 6. With all of my strength, I have worked for your father. And we find that he was not only rewarded in the world to come for this, but even in this world, as it says, in 30:43, and the man became very prosperous.
Excellent, thank you. So this, in many ways, brings together all the principles, which it's a matter of integrity. It's also a mutual relationship. Just as an employer needs to respect his employee and pay them appropriately, so too a worker who's hired for a job needs to do that job and really use the time that they're being paid for appropriately. Now, this hasn't gotten all the little nuances. The reality is this. This is if somebody's moonlighting and they're not able to get their job done and their response is, I can't, I have to moonlight, I'm not making enough money, they're not allowed to take that second job. Now, the sad reality, as Anna was pointing out, is unfortunately that's not something that employees can do. They can't say, well, I'll keep your job, but you got to pay me more. Most of the time that does not work out for them. They either lose their jobs or the answer is simply no. We unfortunately live in a society, and again, it's not universal. You move to Finland and Sweden, it's probably not like this. But in America, oftentimes, a worker cannot just have one job, but they're expected. It's actually oftentimes with students and homework. They have 6 classes, but each teacher, not always, but each teacher often treats them as if that's the only class. And you only have 3 hours to do homework a night, and each teacher gives them 3 hours of homework thinking, oh, well, that's about how much they have per night, not thinking about every other teacher is doing it, how they're going to do 12 hours of homework and still get to sleep. So that's a sad truth, a sad reality common in the United States and perhaps in other countries as well. But strictly speaking, if somebody's outside activities, whether they're not eating because they're, the little food that they get for their job, they're not eating it themselves. That's what he's talking about. They're giving it to their children because they want their children to live, but then they come in starving the next day and they're not able to work the fields. It's probably what a lot of these things are imagining as field workers or field hands. If they're not able to do their job, then they cannot do these other activities. They can't take on other jobs. They can't give away their food. They need to be able to do their job. Now we go back. So that's the clear ruling on if moonlighting will significantly affect one's work. But to the original question, what if it affects the work, but only slightly? The person is getting the job done, but they're not a model employee. They're a perfectly good employee. Their job is to serve 100 hamburgers to 100 customers, and they do it every time. And they're respectful, but they're not going above and beyond. They're not organizing all of the ketchups, or I don't know, whatever an example is. That's not the only job out there. But again, they could be doing more. They could show management potential. It's not what they're doing. They're just doing the job and they're doing it just fine. Would that be permitted? And I don't think the sources we've seen so far give us an absolute yes or no. And I think that's a very interesting thing. If that case came before a Beit Din, and the Beit Din said to the employer, what's the problem? Well, he took on another job and I think it's affecting his work. Is he getting his work done? Well, yes, he's getting it done. What does his contract say he has to do? Well, it says he has to do X, Y, and Z. Is he doing X, Y, and Z? Yes. How does he have to do it, et cetera? And you go through it, and the employer is like, basically, he's getting it done, but I know he could do more. I don't know that that's enough for you to claim that he has to quit that moonlighting job. And this is where these cases are not so black and white and gray area. And as a rabbi and a Beit Din, I may take into consideration, why are they moonlighting? Because they're trying to raise money to buy a yacht, or because they're trying to feed their kids? And if that's the case, then I might be inclined to say that as long as they are doing the job that they are getting paid for, they're doing the work you're paying them for, they're just not an exemplary employee, I don't know that it's forbidden for them to take on a moonlighting job. So this is where you really got to bring in some subjectivity and a little bit of intuition and look at each case by case. But now we've seen the principles this is based on, and the values of integrity in the workplace, and the fundamental thing that when we are working for somebody, it is not our time. Of course, the absolute basics, bathroom and taking care of our personal health, go without saying. It's a matter of, life and death or sickness. But beyond that, it really depends on whether or not it's going to affect our job. So before we go on to the second case, any thoughts, comments, follow-ups, or disagreements with my ruling at the end? And welcome, Deborah. Yeah, Gloria, go ahead, please.
I would think part of it would depend on how much they're getting paid on that full-time job.
Yeah, which is what Anna had mentioned. And again, I think that shouldn't be a factor. And that's why the conversation about universal minimum wage, and if a worker is getting enough that they can feed their family and take care of everything, and minimum wage is never enough to do that. So that's why they often say minimum wage is a terrible phrase. It should be a living wage, which would be much higher. And this gets into not necessarily politics per se, but it just gets very complicated and messy. But I think I can say unequivocally is all workers who do a job should be paid enough so that they're able to take care of their family. Now, how much do they have to work, et cetera, like that can be quibbled over, but workers need to be paid enough to not destroy their physical health. And unfortunately, the reality is, particularly with things like Amazon, we're expected to get every product in the world to somebody within 5 minutes or less. The expectation is that workers have to work to the point where they are endangering their physical and mental health, and they're still not getting paid enough. So I think that's a very important factor, Gloria, is in reality, it shouldn't be a factor. Either you have this job and you put your all into it, or you don't, but most workers don't have that option, which is why these cases cannot be so black and white. If a worker needs to work 3 jobs and they're just not doing their job, they're not fulfilling their obligations, then there's not a lot to protect them from Jewish law. But if they're not giving 100%, but they're still getting the job done, the reality is, I think rabbis with sensitivity, which is important here, would say, it'd be better if you could put more of yourself. That's a Jewish value. But if this is done so you can feed your family and you're getting the work done, then I think that's fine. You can keep the 2 jobs as long as the balance doesn't get out of hand. So any other thoughts, comments, or questions?
Yeah,
Elizabeth, please.
there are a lot of people that do have to take 2 jobs just to feed their families.
Yeah, no question. And that's what I'm saying is 100. And that's the reality that we have to work with in this case. So you have to take this ruling with a grain of salt and read between the lines, which are what are the principles we've gotten up till now, which is valuing the fact that you're getting paid for the work that you're doing. And if you're not doing the work, then you shouldn't get paid. But if you're doing the work, then the employer really shouldn't be able to stop you if you have a legitimate reason. Again, if you're moonlighting and it's really affecting your ability to work, again, you got to look at the underlying principles, not just the final ruling here. Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention maybe a little twist to this discussion, which is
Sure.
there are some jobs that you, when you get employed by them, it's written into the contract that you can't accept a job. You can't do any work outside of this job. And so that in a way makes it clear cut. So if you do, you're breaking the contract.
Yes. So what I didn't say before is the assumption here is that this is something that went to court. If this was put before a Beit Din of 3 rabbis and the employer said, you have to quit your job, and he says, you can't make me, like let's say the employer says, quit your other job or I'll fire you. And he says, I'm doing the work. You have no right to fire me. And they went before a Beit Din, and the employer said, the Shulchan Aruch says you can't take out another job. And the employee says, no, it's as if it affects your work and I'm getting my work done. And also, if I don't take on the second job, I lose my house and my kids don't have food on their table. So that's the back and forth here about that. Now, if the contract says explicitly, take on another job or you're fired, then the employer there's no beit din. You don't have to go to a beit din. The employer has every right to fire them. That's the question. If the employer says, quit that other job or I fire you, then he fires him. Can the employee countersue and saying, I was doing the job, you had no right to fire me, it was a wrongful firing. So these are the things that the Beit Din has to balance back and forth if they're working within the context of Jewish law, which is what we're talking about here. But a lot of these conversations are very, very real, even outside of the Jewish sphere. And a lot of these values about it's not your time. Every second that you're not working can be seen as stealing from your employer if it's not reasonable. And the question is, how far do we get with reasonable? If it's a bathroom break, it should be reasonable, except Amazon has proven that's not, or at least a number of warehouses. I don't want to speak for all of them. And why unions are becoming a huge deal in Starbucks and Amazon, et cetera, like that, to fight against the extreme expectations of workers that are losing their jobs or killing them or making them very, very sick with permanent injuries. It's a very tough time. And again, it's not all. There's some incredible employers out there, and there's a lot of bad situations, but excellent. So any other thoughts, or we'll go on to our next case. Beautiful. So the next case here is the one that I had mentioned last time, which is owning stock in a company which sells non-kosher food. Now, in many ways, this harkens back to the class we had about farming pigs in Israel and essentially making your business out of treif non-kosher food. And in fact, the first source, this conversation about owning stocks in companies that make non-kosher goes back to a source that we actually saw in that class. So it's based off a source in the Talmud, Psachim 23a, but we're going to actually start with the ruling. And Jane, I will go ahead and unmute you. And I'll actually have you take two sources. So the first one here is, again, it's the ruling from Shulchan Aruch, but obviously this represents hundreds of years of discussions, some of which we'll come back to. So please.
Anything that is specifically for eating and biblically prohibited, even though it is not forbidden to derive benefit from it, is forbidden to do business with it.
Excellent, thank you. So why is this important? If I am making, here's a one. If I make violins, and I don't think they do this anymore, but strings used to be made out of cat gut. Now cats are forbidden biblically to eat, but I'm not using them for eating, I'm using them to make violin strings. Therefore, I could potentially have a business where I make fancy violins with treif cats. And we'll get to in a moment why that might be fine, because it has to do, again, with what are the underlying reasons that you're not allowed to do this. Because if we look back in the Torah, when it talks about animals that are and are not kosher, it never actually says this animal is kosher to eat. What it actually says is these animals are pure or impure. And purity, all that tameh and tahor, all that really has to do with is if I eat or come into contact with these animals, it affects my ability to go into the temple or the Mishkan, or whether I'm allowed to use it in a sacrifice. So it doesn't explicitly talk about eating or not. So forget about that. Forget about just eating. It certainly doesn't talk about doing business with these things. So a lot of these laws are derived indirectly through the Talmud. And I didn't want to bring all of the different Talmudic sources where they argue, is there an actual law from the Torah about doing business, selling pork burgers, or is that rabbinic because the rabbis are concerned with, we'll see the concerns in the second source here. So is the Torah actually forbidden, or is the rabbi did it because they have some concerns? But if I want to make catgut violin strings, that would be fine. But if I wanted to make a business where I sold cheeseburgers, mixing milk and meat, which is considered biblically prohibited, and I'm selling it for food, that would be absolutely forbidden to make a business out of it. Or as we saw last class, being a pig farmer, and here's a key, if I'm raising these pigs for medical purposes, for testing medicines, which that's a separate ethical question about that, but let's say that was my business. I raise pigs to develop medicines or diabetic insulin, I think they use pigs for that. If that was my purpose of the pigs, that would be fine. Yes, they're biblically prohibited, but I'm not raising them for food. Or let's say another one. What if it's chicken and milk, kosher chicken and milk? Because we're not talking about animals that have been slaughtered. So I buy Empire kosher chicken and I'm selling it, but I'm selling it with cheese on it, even kosher cheese. Now, Jewish law today says that's not permitted. But if anyone reads the Talmud, they'll see explicitly that meat and chicken is not forbidden by the Torah. So I can't eat it, but I could do business with it. So if I was making chicken cheese sandwiches, that's not a good business for a Jew. It's just not, quality, it's just not a good idea for them to do. But is it forbidden? No. I could have a chicken parm, that'd be a good example. I could have a chicken parm business because yes, it is for food, but it's not biblically prohibited. So we are talking about something which is both forbidden explicit by the Torah, again, cheeseburgers, and it has to be for food. So owning a McDonald's is a no-go for a Jew. Owning a Arby's is a no-go for a Jew. I assume they have lots of tray food there. But the question here is why? Why is this a problem? Because the Torah does not talk about going into business with these treif animals. It just says they're not pure in relation to sacrifices in the temple or the Mishkan. So why did the rabbis say it's forbidden, either biblically or based on the Torah? And Jane, I'll have you take this as well. This is the Siftei Kohen, Rabbi Shabtai Kohen, and he wrote one of the most, probably the most direct commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and he brings in two different reasons why owning a business, we haven't gotten to stocks yet, but owning a business where you sell biblically treif food is problematic. So go ahead, please, Jane.
It's forbidden to do business with it. The reason is that one might come to eat the food, or rather that one who sees the seller with the forbidden food will think they are doing business in a way in which they might come to eat or taste the food.
Excellent, thank you. Now, we don't actually know which is the reason for this enactment of the Shulchan Aruch, which he gets from the Talmud. He doesn't come up with it himself. And what ultimately happens is the rabbis practically say you have to take both into consideration. Meaning if there's a business where it looks like they might eat the food, that's problematic. Or if the business where they actually might eat the food, it really doesn't matter. Practically speaking, if a Jew is around treif, biblically forbidden food all the time, whether or not they're tasting it or whether or not people think they're tasting it, this enactment comes into place. So if a Jew is directly, and we'll come back to that word directly, if a Jew is directly involved in a business in which they are in either have direct access or in direct relationship with biblically forbidden food, it is not permitted. And there's really no exceptions to it if they have that direct connection. So before we go on, are there any questions up until now? Yeah, Anna, you just have to unmute yourself.
Okay. I'm wondering if this applies to a couple of things. One of them is working like as a employee at one of these
Wait,
establishments.
Anna, before you go on, is there a way, I don't know if you're on a wireless microphone. I don't know if there's a way to talk directly into the computer or just getting a lot of gargle. And I'm so sorry, I want to hear your question.
Understood that she said that, does this also relate to the fact that you're an employee? Let's say you work at McDonald's. How do these laws affect you? If I'm correct.
So this would actually be it's not just about owning, it's about making it your business.
Okay.
Yeah, because in fact, the phrase here in the Hebrew, the last three words in the Hebrew on the bottom line, la'asot bo sechora, to do with it, these forbidden foods, to do with them business. So it doesn't actually say to be a Baal, an owner or a master. So yes, a Jew, and this is a really interesting thing, is if a Jew wants to study at a culinary school, and one of the things they have to do is they have to prepare food that has beef and cheese together, milk and meat in that way, that would be a real halachic issue. But if they're creating chicken parmesan, they're not allowed to eat it, but because it's rabbinically forbidden, there's leniency for them to learn with it. So there is no major distinction between whether you're the owner or you are getting paid from it. If my business, my job, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so that would like.
Oh, I can hear you perfectly now.
Yeah, I think it's the headphones. I don't know.
So
they don't even connect to the microphone. I don't get it.
I'm so sorry, but yeah, so that's the first answer. No, this would apply to anybody who their paycheck comes directly from working with, again, biblically prohibited food. Meaning, if I'm making footballs, pigskin footballs, pigs are biblically prohibited, but I'm not going to eat the footballs. So that would be fine if I owned or worked for a football factory. Again, just
Yeah.
like raising pigs for medicine. Yeah, so that's the first thing. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so that would apply to like McDonald's, Pick and Save, places like that. Okay.
So
And then,
it's a very interesting, just pause for a moment.
okay,
At McDonald's, a person will almost certainly, who works there, will pretty much certainly be expected to work with real tray food, i.e. meat and milk, even if they say, well, technically I'm on the fry-o-lator. Again, going back to the second source here, where the concern is tasting it, or people might think that you're eating it. And if you're an employee there, many employees eat the food there, that would imply to someone at McDonald's. Pick and Save, I don't think so. Why? Because it is not the expectation that most employees, first of all, a significant amount of the food at Pick and Save is kosher, or fruit, vegetables, et cetera, like that. And it's also not terribly, I mean, even if a lot of workers at supermarkets do eat the food there, there's so many kosher options that I don't think that would be an issue there.
okay,
Meaning that it's fair to assume that somebody who's, if a Jew sees someone working at a supermarket, it is reasonable to assume they're probably not eating the tray stuff. They might be. And I do want to step back and say, none of this is judgmental about people who don't keep kosher. We're talking about for somebody who is keeping kosher and choosing a life in which they keep all these laws, may they work at a McDonald's, even though they're like, oh, I'll never eat a cheeseburger. Can I work at a McDonald's? No. Can I work at a Pick and Save? Of course, because the
yeah,
huge amount of the food there is totally kosher, and we can assume that they're not specifically eating tray. So that's to that question.
okay,
Yeah, please continue.
yeah. The other one was just like, it's similar, but I was thinking like things that are not directly related to the work necessarily. Like if you're working at a school, for example, and the food the kids eat isn't kosher.
So I think, and
But
again,
like,
these questions are great
yeah,
because they'll be excellent lead-ins to the answer to our question about owning stocks. And it goes back to that word that I said is so key, is the direct nature of it. And that goes back to the second source. And by the way, the Shach, the Siftei Cohen, he didn't come up with these ideas. These are based off of earlier rabbis and Rishonim, meaning the early authorities, and Rashba and all these different ones. And I just didn't want to bring in too many sources here. But both of these reasons about we're concerned they actually will eat the food, or people might think they're eating the food. Someone working at a Pick and Save, we don't really expect, like a frum Jew could eat. In fact, there's an Orthodox Jew who works at Metro Market in Mequon. Nobody thinks he's going around eating the tray food. Technically, could he? Sure, but no one expects that. I don't believe at all that he is. No one expects that. And so too with a school. Nobody expects, even though it certainly could happen, the general expectation, the way most people think, is not that every teacher at a public school is tasting the ham slices before giving it to the kids. Everyone knows that the lunches served there are often, not always, by the way, we're still talking about things that are biblically prohibited. And plenty of lunches at schools are not biblically, the pizza is not kosher per se, but it's not forbidden by the Torah, it's forbidden rabbinically. So again, it's, there's many different steps away from our source number one here about directly working with biblically prohibited food. McDonald's is one where a person really would be doing that. A vegetarian restaurant, though, would be, again, I don't know that an observant Jew would want to work at a non-kosher restaurant, but strictly speaking, there's no issue there. And there are a lot of vegan places, and an observant Jew wants to eat there. Now, could they eat that food there? They gave a class on vegan restaurants. Technically, no, they couldn't just eat the food without doing a few things to make sure it's okay, et cetera, like that. It's easy, but it's not automatic. But at McDonald's, it's a real problem, or Burger King or Hardee's or whatever it is, all of these restaurants that are nothing wrong with the restaurants, but a Jew working there can cause a problem because of the direct association and at least assumption that they might be engaging in some way or another with this super tray food, which you don't have at a school, you don't have it at Pick and Save. And our last question is, do you have it for stock owners? Does a stock owner of Disneyland, which I own Disney stock, does that mean that as a stock owner, I am every day eating, the shrimp at, Disney World? I actually don't know what they serve there. I haven't been there. That's not a reasonable assumption. No one assumes that a stockholder owns 0.001% is eating the tray food they serve at Disney World. And we'll see that come out in two very interesting ways, which these next two rulings are not explicitly talking about working with non-kosher food, but they are extremely relevant to our case at hand because they talk about owning stocks in a company which does things that are biblically forbidden, and whether or not owning stock in them is okay. So the first one is from Rav Moshe Feinstein, Igra Moshe, and again, he's a 20th century rabbi, came from Eastern Europe, but he really established himself in America. And he talks about companies, which is super common. Disney is open on Shabbat. Disney is open on Yom Kippur. Can I own stock in a company that's open on Yom Kippur? And by the way, potentially serving food to non-observant Jews that might be on there on Yom Kippur. Although I feel like maybe that's less likely, but can I own stock in such a company? And Elizabeth, if you would unmute yourself, please. And again, while this isn't directly about food, it's very, very relevant to our case at hand. So please, go ahead.
Regarding the matter of shares in companies that do business on Shabbat, we do not consider the purchaser of shares to be a purchaser of the business, for they have no opinion in the business. And the purchaser does not want to be an owner and doesn't want to be part of the business, but only purchases the profits and losses. Further, this purchase isn't in accordance with the Jewish halacha, but only works according to the law of the land. Even though the shareholder can vote, this is only an illusion because practically the owners leave themselves a majority of shares. So we cannot say that the purchaser of shares is an owner, but to purchase many shares so the company considers your opinion is forbidden.
Excellent, thank you. And I just want to point out something. So Rashi in his commentaries, when he saw words in the Torah that didn't, wasn't easy to explain them, he would often translate them into French. So we actually learned a lot about Old French, but one of the things I love Rav Moshe Feinstein, many things for, is, I don't know if you can see it on the right in the Hebrew, when he talks about shares and stocks, he writes Shin Ayin Resh Samech, he writes shares. He just writes it out, which is probably more of a Yiddishism than an English thing, but it's really cool. There are a lot of words that are just, phonetic that he writes out. So he talks about shares, but again, his point here is this: the issue with doing business with forbidden foods, again, it might be because people are assume you're eating it or tasting it, or you might actually be doing it. But that is only if you are directly involved. That says you cannot make your money directly from this tray food. Rav Moshe's point is, and again, it's not about food, it's about Shabbat, but his point is this: I am not making my money from Disneyland being open on Shabbat. They are not open on Shabbat, and then they say, okay, today on Saturday, we made this much money, okay, and Rabbi Joel Dinan is gonna get this percentage from the sales we made today. That's not how it works. I make money when Disney stock goes up. I make money from Disney, the brand, not from the work that they do on Shabbat, and that's an important distinction. The law of the Shulchan Aruch is I cannot make my money from biblically forbidden food. Rabbinically, fine. Things that are not food, fine. Biblically forbidden food, I can't make money from that. And again, Disney certainly serves that. But when you own stocks, you're not making money from that. However, this is an important thing that we'll see also in the last source. This is a distinction, and it's the phrase almost in Hebrew might be a chidush, like a new idea. So how do we decide when it's appropriate to own stocks in a company? What point do we say you're not making money from the direct day-to-day sales? So let's say I own 100% of the stock. It means I'm the owner of the company. Everything they do, and again, that's one extreme. If I own 100% of the stocks, not stocks anymore, I own the company. Every single penny they make, no matter whether it's Shabbat, treif, whatever, is I'm making money directly off of that. But if I have 2% of it, it's like much like Anna, the thing about pick and save. It's very easy to say I'm not making my money off of the tray food them selling. It's off of something else they're doing. Even if it's Bubba Gump Shrimp Company, and most of their money is made off of tray food, again, I'm not making it off of the shrimp, I'm making off of the business model. You might find rabbis who say if a company's only product is literally just pork, maybe that wouldn't be okay. But his distinction here is as long as you're not a majority stockholder. Because if you're a majority stockholder, then not only is it easier to say that you are more directly making money off of the day-to-day and Shabbat or tray food, but also because you have a controlling interest in the company, it looks like you're a major owner. And we think that you might actually be going to Disneyland and tasting their wares and have more of a hands-on thing. But here's the interesting thing. I don't know if it comes up in the last one, but the idea that, let's say I am a 51% stockholder, and I go to the company and I say, we're no longer serving tray food. 51%, I mean, there's ways for them to overrule me, but let's say 51%, I can do that. And then it's not a problem. We're not serving treif anymore. We're not open on Shabbat if I'm a majority stockholder, and then there's no issue. But if I'm 10% and I have a vote, okay, I have a vote, but I say we should stop serving treif food, and they laugh in my face, do I really have a vote? Am I really an owner of the company? And that's the distinction Rav Moshe is making. If my vote actually matters, I'm an owner in the company and I'm making real money off of day-to-day things. But if my vote doesn't practically matter, then it's hard to say that I'm really benefiting off of them being open on Shabbat, etc. And this last source here, which actually chronologically is earlier, but it's also very relevant, from this Maharia Halevi, 18th century Ukraine. And I'll just take this last one. So he actually talks about a company that sells chametz. They sell bread. So they sell bread, even Wonder Bread, it's treif bread, but they sell bread on Pesach. It is forbidden by the Torah for a Jew to own bread on Pesach. Well, I own shares in Wonder Bread. Is that the same as owning bread on Pesach? And again, the same principles are applied here. In our case, it is known that the shareholders have no ownership and power to sell the chametz or to burn it. If I called Wonder Bread and I said, oh, it's Pesach in 3 days, can you go ahead and burn the $40 or $2 billion worth of bread that you have in all of your stores and sell it all for the next 8 days? No, they're not going to do it. Therefore, I don't have any real ownership over it. My money is basically, when the company gets rich, then they will give me money. That's basically what it is. I invested in them in stocks so they could do their business. And if they do well, they're going to give me money back. But I'm not making money by selling or owning bread. Again, if Disney, I don't own Disney. I gave Disney money as a stockholder, even if it's a tiny percentage, so that they could do their business. Kind of like with a bank. When I put my money in the bank, I give them my money. They can do whatever they want with it. As long as at the end of the day, the bank doesn't go under, I get my money back with a small percentage increase. Very, very small. But again, I don't own Disney. I don't own the bank. It's just if they do well, they'll pay me back because I invested in them. But I don't own bread. I don't own Disney. So he says, for the business is conducted according to the wise leaders, that's nice that they're saying wise leaders, these companies, to benefit their business. And since the stock owner cannot burn the chametz, he does not violate the prohibition of seeing chametz on Passover, again, because he has no power or control over the chametz, it's impossible to say it is his or hers. In our case, it is impossible that the chametz will arrive in the hands of the stock owners because they have nothing to do with the business, just that they got profits and losses. Again, if Disney makes money, they're happy and they'll pay me back because I invested in them. But they have no ownership over the land or the property. And when people actually give their rulings, their final rulings on owning stock in a company that serves treif, these are the exact same answers they give. As long as you do not have a controlling interest in the pork or whatever, you're fine. And if I did have a controlling interest, it would be my responsibility to, if I'm Elon Musk and I buy out McDonald's, which he probably could do or close to do it, and I said, we're no longer serving biblically forbidden food, that'd be a funny day, and they all say absolutely not, then clearly I don't really have any power and I don't own those burgers. They're basically saying to me, you have no power over our treif food. And if that's true, if I have no power over it, then I don't own it. And therefore I'm not responsible or doing direct business with that treif food if I have zero control over what happens to it. Versus if I worked for or certainly owned a McDonald's, I do have direct impact over what happens with that food. I can decide whether or not I'll get fired, but I could decide whether or not to make a cheeseburger or whether or not to sell it to someone who comes in. If a Jew walks in and I work in a McDonald's and I say, you're a Jew, you don't get a cheeseburger, I'll get fired, but I don't have that kind of power. Or sorry, I do have that kind of power. I do have that kind of power, and that's where it would get problematic, where I do decide the day-to-day of what happens with this treif food, even though, of course, I would get fired. So our final question that we started with, can a Jew own stock in a company that does biblically forbidden things? The answer is, as long as I do not have a control, a significant power in the day-to-day things, which means that I don't really own it in any real way, then I can certainly own stock in that because, again, I'm not doing business with treif. I'm not doing business on Shabbat. I'm not doing business with chametz on Pesach. The companies are, and then they decide to pay me back because essentially I invested in them, and that's not the same as doing business with it. So basically stocks are fine as long as you're not a majority stockholder, but working at certain businesses or certainly owning a franchise, a Subway franchise or something like that would be deeply problematic. But working at a vegan restaurant or a place that only has, or working at a cordon, or learning at cordon bleu and only making chicken parm or other things that are not biblically forbidden, that could potentially be fine. It may be discouraged, but it is certainly permitted. So again, these cases are not only relevant based on very ancient principles, but it's still very much able to adapt and respond to new realities. And again, as things become more digital and we actually have, our money is coming less and less from actually engaging directly in businesses with cryptocurrency and everything, it actually makes Jewish law function a little bit more easily. Can I buy a digital currency if I know that the computer that's allowing it to run, et cetera, like that is working through Shabbat? And the answers are often yes, because my ownership, my financial benefit is not directly tied to it running on Shabbat. It's often 5 or 6 steps removed. So this helps a lot in the modern digital world to be able to engage fully with the world around us. But there are absolutely still limits, and that's why it's important to learn and engage with these laws.